Okay, so now we're going to continue with endocrine, and we're going to be learning about the pancreas. And this is going to be one of the endocrine organs that doesn't fall into that pituitary axis. So we're not really talking about what's going on in the anterior pituitary and how it affects the pancreas. This is something that is kind of separate. And so this is a little new idea, because we've been talking about the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and then all the endocrine organs and targets that respond to the anterior pituitary and its hormones. So the pancreas kind of lies outside of that. And so let's remind you where the pancreas is. If you probably haven't learned a whole lot about digestion yet, but if you think back to maybe your first anatomy, you learned about the small intestine and the liver. So here was your liver, and the gallbladder was kind of on the down and below and behind the liver. This is the part of the small intestine called the duodenum or the duodenum. And so this comma-shaped organ here, this is called the pancreas. And it plays a role in allowing you to regulate your blood glucose levels. Okay, so that's its job. It also plays a role in digestion. So it's one of those organs, just like the thyroid made two different hormones, one for metabolic activity and one for calcium. The pancreas does more than one thing. It makes several hormones, and it has an endocrine function as well as a digestive function. Okay, so I'm going to show you what that looks like. If you zoom into the pancreas, you're going to see that it's got basically separate anatomy. There are parts of these pancreas that are specifically the endocrine function. These are called the islets of Langerhans. That's the endocrine function. And then you have these digestive pits, I would call them, these areas that you can secrete enzymes, and that's the digestive portion. So this has got both an exocrine function and an endocrine function. Okay, so I wanted to kind of, before I went to that slide, see if you guys could maybe think about what those words were. So it's this kind of comma-shaped, triangular-shaped gland behind the stomach, and it's exocrine and endocrine. So remember, exocrine means it releases something through a duct to an opening, so like salivary glands. So this is going to send something into the small intestine. And endocrine, which means it secretes hormones into the blood. Okay, so we're going to mostly focus on the endocrine function now. We'll work on the exocrine function when we get to the digestive system. There's two different types of cells in the pancreas. Well, actually, there's more than two. There's we'll kind of go back. You have the acinar cells. These are your exocrine cells. They're the ones that make the enzymes for digestion. Okay. Then you have these islands. These little islands of specialized cells are called the pancreatic islets or islands of Langerhans. And these are where all your endocrine cells are. And there's several of those. You have alpha cells and beta cells. The alpha cells make glucagon, which is considered your hyperglycemic hormone. And the beta cells make insulin, which is considered your hypoglycemic hormone. So one of these increases blood sugar levels in the sugar levels in the blood, and one of these decreases sugar levels in the blood. Okay, so we're going to talk about which one does which. So again, just to kind of show you, we're going to do your lab separately, but this is a pancreatic islet. Okay, so this it kind of stands out when you look at a pancreas. You'll see these islands of cells that look a little bit different. And I'm actually not going to make you identify the alpha cells and beta cells in the lab because it's really kind of hard to tell from a picture. But you'll need to know that the alpha cells and beta cells are both in those pancreatic islets. The alpha cells make glucagon and the beta cells make insulin. Okay, but you won't have to actually be able to distinguish the two on a histology slide. Okay, and this is showing that you've got the exocrine stuff around it, those acinar cells. So what does glucagon do? It's a hormone. And it's a hormone released by the pancreas, those pancreatic alpha cells, and its target is the liver. And what it does is it increases blood glucose levels. All right, it increases. So that means it responds when blood sugar levels are low. It causes your blood sugar levels to rise. And the way it does that is through glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Those are fun to say, but let's break them down and you can figure out what they do. Glycogenolysis. You're breaking down glycogen. If you remember back to your early chemistry, remember glucose looks kind of something like that, right? Well, glycogen is just a bunch of chains. We've linked glucose together to store it. That's one way we store glucose, and so we can use it later. So glycogenolysis, you're going to break those bonds and release that glucose, and we use glucose to make ATP. Okay. Gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis. Remember, we want to increase blood glucose levels. So one thing we can do is we can make glucose from lactic acid and other non-carbohydrates. So neogenesis, to make, synthesize glucose from a source, another source, like fat and like lactic acid and non-carbohydrates. So when you do this, both of these together, the end result is to release glucose into the blood. So go back again. I try not to give you, direct answers, but I try to give you hints. Go back and look at the adrenal gland, and one of those adrenal hormones had something to do with glucose as well. So see if you can go back and see how that would tie into this as well. Did it release glucose or store glucose? Just go back and look. I'm not going to tell you. You guys got to go back and look. All right, so let's talk about insulin, the other hormone. And so insulin, also found in those pancreatic islet cells, its job is to lower blood glucose levels. And it does that by enhancing membrane transport of glucose into fat and muscle cells. So it's drawing glucose out of the blood and putting it into the cells. So you're just taking the sugar out of the cells, out of the blood into the cells, so that the cells can use that glucose to make ATP. So it's a way of feeding the cells, literally. You're getting that glucose into the cell. They're actually transporters, and it kind of turns those on and causes you to be able to transport glucose into those different cells using membrane transport. It inhibits glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Okay, so if you're trying to get glucose out of the blood, you don't want these things to happen. All right. It also plays a role in neuronal development, in learning and memory. We won't focus a whole lot on that right now. We're going to mostly focus on sugar regulation. You don't need insulin to take glucose into the liver, the kidney, or the brain. Your other cells use it, but there are other mechanisms for glucose transport in those organs. And again, we'll focus on those at another time. So what happens when insulin binds? When glucose enters a cell, when insulin is, again, it's a hormone, so it's going to bind a receptor, just like other hormones do. It causes it kind of catalyzes or increases the rate of using glucose to make ATP. So that's good, because if we're feeding the cells, if we're giving them glucose, so that's the main job of the cell, is to make that ATP. It will, once you've got the glucose in the cell, it can then you can store it. So then you're going to polymerize glucose to form glycogen. So once you've got it out of the blood, now you can store it, because you want to trying to get it out of the blood. So let's save it for later. So you're going to start taking those glucoses and adding them together to make the glycogen. It also allows you, especially in fat, to convert glucose to fat. So it's what helps us turn our sugar into fat. So when you think about these two hormones, glucagon and insulin, they're antagonists. That means they do the opposite thing. So glucagon is hyperglycemic and insulin is hypoglycemic. So what does that mean? Let's start at a point. So this is falling blood sugar. Okay, so my blood sugar is falling. What do I want to do? If my blood sugar is falling, I've got to get sugar back to my blood. All right, so which hormone do you think would do that? The hyperglycemic. We're going to do something to raise blood sugar. So the pancreas will release glucagon. That's going to go to the liver, which is its target. All right, convert glycogen to glucose. That releases glucose into the blood. So now blood sugar levels are rising. So those blood sugar levels are rising. We don't want them to get too high. So now the levels are going up and up and up and up. Well, the pancreas now will respond to those high levels of sugar by releasing insulin. Insulin does two things. It causes the cells to just take the glucose out of the blood and put it into the cells, It also causes the liver to store that glucose to glycogen so we can use it later. Okay, so that by taking that glucose out of the blood, those glucose levels are going to fall. So glucagon and insulin kind of work in balance in an antagonistic way to help us maintain homeostasis by allowing us to keep our sugar levels at a pretty normal level. Okay, so think about this. I like to kind of give you an idea to think about how you would need to study for a test. You know, which one of these hormones is going to show up after a meal? Okay, so you've just gone and grabbed a Snickers bar. Which hormone do you expect to be released from the pancreas? Let's say it's 10 o'clock at night and you skip supper and feeling a little hungry. Which hormone do you think is going to be kicking in to allow your body to release sugar because there's no food for you to eat? So think about when you would have these different hormones be released. Is it just after a meal? Is that insulin or is that glucagon? If you're fasting, is that insulin or is that glucagon? You should be able to figure that out. Again, I don't at this level, I don't give you the direct answers because I think you can figure it out. And obviously you can read in your textbook and you can email me and ask me, okay? But try to figure it out first. Try to make sense of it on your own. All right, so let's talk about some problems with insulin. I don't really talk about the glucagon issue. We'll mostly focus on insulin. We'll have some case studies for you guys to look at and talk about. When you have a homeostatic imbalance of insulin, the thing that most of us hear about is diabetes, and that's diabetes mellitus. Okay, and some people say mellitus. I say mellitus. There's probably several different ways to say it. Diabetes means to siphon or to flow. Okay, and mellitus means honey. So in people who are diabetic, they tend to make a lot of urine, and this urine is sweet. Okay, because you're spilling sugar into the urine. And you may have already heard this in a previous lecture. The old way of figuring out what kind of diabetes someone had was to just taste it and see if it was sweet or not. So if you have hyposecretion, okay, that is type 1. You've heard of type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. Type 1, a lot of times juvenile diabetes, a lot of times you'll hear that. You're not making enough insulin or not making any at all. And that's usually an autoimmune disease where you've destroyed that part of your pancreas. Type 2 is hypoactivity. That means you're still making insulin, but your cells aren't really responding to it anymore. Okay, so the receptors don't really respond like they're supposed to. This is the one that's going to be associated with obesity. So people who are overweight tend to form type 2 diabetes. In either case, blood sugars are going to stay high, and that can cause nausea. That can cause kind of panic because you have high glucose levels, so kind of a fight or flight response. It causes glucosuria, which is glucose being spilled into the urine. Because our cells are literally starving to death because the insulin either not there in type 1 or not effective in type 2, we can't get the sugar into our cells. So our cells are just starving to death. They can't get that sugar. But we've got to use something. We've got to use something to make ATP. So we start to turn fat. That's how we're starting to use fat as our cellular fluid, our cellular fuel, especially in type 1s. And so you can start to burn these fats. And one of the byproducts is an acid byproduct, and we call that ketoacidosis. So when you start to use fat as a byproduct, you get an acid formed, and so you start to become acidotic. Your system becomes more acid. This ketoacidosis causes people to have a sweet breath. So a lot of times, one of the first symptoms or signs a parent will notice in a child with type 1 diabetes is they're thirsty all the time. They pee all the time, and they have a sweet breath. And so if you notice that about your kid, you know, they're thirstier than they should be. They're not outside in the heat all the time. They're drinking all the time. They're going to the bathroom all the time, and they kind of have a sweet breath. That could be, they're thin, that you can't fill them up. They're always hungry. That could be a sign of diabetes. If you don't treat this ketoacidosis, it can cause disrupted heart activity. It can cause problems with oxygen transport. It can depress the nervous system and lead to coma and death. So that's the problem with untreated ketoacidosis, which is a result of untreated type of untreated diabetes. So what they call the cardinal signs, like I just said, what are you looking for if you're wondering if someone's diabetic? They're polyuria, which means huge urine output. Not only because they're drinking all the time, because they have polydipsia, which is excessive thirst, but the urine, the glucose in the urine, it acts like sodium. Remember how water follows sodium? Well, glucose acts as an osmotic diuretic. It pulls water with it. So you make a lot of urine. You're also thirsty all the time. And of course you're losing all that water because of that polyuria. So you're spilling out all that glucose, all that water, so it makes you thirsty all the time. And because your cells are literally starving to death, you have polyphagia, which is excessive hunger and food consumption, okay, because your cells are starving. All right, so there's basically 4 types of diabetes. I want to spend just a few minutes, and I want you to spend some time on your own going over these 4 different types. There'll be some kind of questions comparing and contrasting different types of diabetes. You have diabetes mellitus, you have type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is called insulin dependent or juvenile diabetes, so there's no insulin, okay, so there's just none produced. It's autoimmune, and for some reason the pancreas just doesn't do it. Type 2, non-insulin dependent. This is insulin resistance, so the cells fail to use the insulin properly. It doesn't bind properly. The transporters aren't opened properly. You don't get the sugar into your cells properly, and typically it's linked to poor diet and obesity. Untreated, it can lead to the need of taking insulin. Okay, so some people with type 2 will actually take insulin to try to override the system and get those cells to take in that sugar. It's probably not the best way of explaining it, but it's kind of the way I found for my students to sort of understand it when I'm in the lab. So when you think about type 2, the receptors are there, okay, but they've become resistant. So let's just say this is the insulin. I kind of think of it too. You know how we've talked about sensory adaptation, where you light a candle and you notice it, and then 5 minutes later the smell's still there, but you kind of ignore it. It's still in the room, but you don't notice it anymore. That's kind of like this. So the insulin's there, the receptors are there, but they're just like and kind of ignoring them. So that's kind of what that means when we say insulin resistant. I know, not very scientific, but hopefully a way to get you to sort of think about how that works. Again, you can read in your textbook for kind of a little more detail on that. Gestational diabetes. So this is diabetes during pregnancy. This is temporary, and basically everything's ramped up during pregnancy, and you can't make enough insulin. And so you're not able to use your food properly. You can't store and use the sugars like you should because you're not making enough insulin. So you tend to spill that extra. You have high sugar in your blood and spill that extra sugar in your urine. This can cause preeclampsia and cause some problems with pregnancy. So that's when they make you drink that nasty orange stuff, and then they make you come back 30 minutes and an hour and 2 hours and measure your blood sugar levels to see if you have gestational diabetes or not, because it needs to be treated, because it can put you on bed rest and cause lots of problems. And then the other one is diabetes insipidus, and we talked about this earlier. It has nothing to do with sugar, has nothing to do with insulin. This has to do with a deficiency in antidiuretic hormone. So this is not sweet. So the old taste test, it was bitter, not a sweet test, so it was insipid. So this is going to be a diabetes where you're thirsty and you have a lot of severely diluted urine, but no sugar involved. And that's going to be diabetes insipidus, which is due to ADH. All right. What if you have maybe too much insulin, hyperinsulinism? It's hard to say. Too much insulin. That causes hypoglycemia. Okay, so kind of the bottom drops out. And you just there's all your blood sugar is you feel like it's gone. You feel weak, maybe disoriented, maybe nervous, anxious, unconscious. It can actually kill you. And so if you're one of these people that maybe you've had breakfast and about 10 o'clock, you're like, I need something. A lot of people tend to get some transient hypoglycemia. So what do? You grab some sugar. This can also happen in diabetics who need to closely monitor their intake and their insulin intake. So maybe they have a pump, or they give themselves insulin shots, and maybe they've overdone it. They give themselves too much insulin, and all of a sudden their sugar kind of bottoms out and they feel terrible, and so they'll drink orange juice or eat a candy. So a lot of times you'll notice diabetics will keep candy with them, and you're like, oh, that doesn't sound right. They shouldn't be eating candy, but they will if they kind of overtreat themselves. Oh, and that's it. All right, so again, here we are at the end of another lecture, and I will see you the next time. See ya. Thanks.